Several years ago, the Arkansas-Oklahoma Synod was having a retreat for mostly young adults. I say mostly young adults because some of us may have been young, but not chronologically so young. But it was a retreat to assist those young folks in pondering, in thinking about, in discerning ways that God may be calling them to ministry within the church, to identified work as a part of the church body. And as we went through that couple of days of retreat, it came time for the bishop to stand up and offer his presentation. And he talked about a variety of things that were quite helpful. Things like when you go to consult with people, whether they be family or friends or church members or even your pastor, make sure that, particularly about things like your discernment on whether you are called to be a pastor or to be on one of the other rosters of the church, make sure that you go to people that you can trust to speak the truth to you. You don't want to get into a place where you get somewhere down the line and somebody says, well, yeah, I never really thought that would work out for you. You want people who can be honest with you and to speak that truth with kindness, even though it hurts. The other thing he talked about, though, was something that we understand within the church, and we don't talk about it a lot, but I'm going to spend some time with it today. And that is that in many ways in the church, particularly within the ELCA, we understand God's call to come in two forms. One form is an external call. That external call is when people look at a young person and say, you know, I can see in the way that you carry yourself. I can hear in the way that you read the scriptures. I can hear in the way that you interact with other people that you have a gift for sharing the good news of God and Jesus Christ. I heard a rumor once of a congregation. Now, this is way back when we only called men to be leaders in the church. Some of you remember that day. They had a group of men who actively prayed about who in their congregation, which young person, young man in that day, young person had gifts for ministry, and then they made decisions about who would best be gifted for building a relationship with that young person and helping that young person come to clarity. That's external call. It comes from outside of us. But there's another kind of call. It's called an internal call. It's when we can feel something, when we experience something that energizes us, that gives us a sense that this is what God desires me to do. Now, that's true whether you choose to live your ministry, your baptismal call in the church, or whether that happens in any other vocation. Truly, there is internal call, that commitment, but there's also that external call, that affirmation by the community. Now, what the bishop went on to say was he started to tell his own call story. Because quite frankly, if you're going to go into ministry, I am here to tell you, you need to get good at telling your call story. All right? So start practicing now. So he told his call story, and his call story, he talked about ways in which, as a young man, he had experienced that kind of internal sense of call, and he came home from school at one point, and he announced to his father that in spite of the direction that he had been headed, he now experienced a call to ministry and was going to be going to seminary. His dad was not particularly happy. Hear that? Internal call, external call. I suspect his dad had a plan for him that had to do something to do with helping Dad do Dad's work. I believe it may have been on a farm. This internal call had kind of messed with that. He said then later on, as he had been pastor for a while, there came a point where all these other pastors and colleagues in the church would come up to him, and not just them, but members of the church and others would say, you know, we really need you. We want you to be able to make yourself available for election to be bishop. And he said, no, that's not me. I don't have the gifts for that. I do not experience that sense of call. And he backed away from it. And they kept coming to him. He said that in so many ways, he had already, he in the end decided to make himself available for election. See what the Holy Spirit might do. And you know what? The Holy Spirit saw fit through the Synod Assembly to elect him to be the bishop. And all of a sudden, he had this external call, but the internal call hadn't quite caught up. And so he had to live into being bishop for a while his internal sense of what that role and responsibility meant for him. Sometimes we have to let our internal sense of call catch up with what the community has called us to do and to be. And that points out one of the other challenges. Now, back in Jeremiah's day, everybody was clear that your identity was not something that you created for yourself. Your identity was something that you received from your family. Your identity was something that came from whose family you were, whose son or daughter you were, and your community told you where you were and what you were going to do. You know, that whole thing about how names, and we still hear vestiges of them, right? The names told you who they were and what they did. Identity was an external thing that you received from the community, from your family. Now, today in America, we would like to claim that it isn't like that anymore, that it comes from somewhere inside of here. But I suggest that it's quite possible, particularly in communities like this, where, well, we know your family. We know your parents. We know your generations. We know you. And so at some levels, there can be that internal identity formation, but the truth of the matter is there are strong and powerful realities of the community still giving identity. Now, I've been thinking about all of this as I have been wrestling with what Jeremiah says to the people of Judah in our reading today. It's important for us to pay attention to what's been going on. Now, Jeremiah, you might remember he was a young guy when God called him to be a prophet. And he argued with God that being young, he didn't have the skill or the experience or the ability or any of that. And God said, don't worry about it. I'll give you what you need. You might also remember, if you were to go back to the first chapter of Jeremiah and read that call story, that when God identifies 6 things that Jeremiah is going to be doing, fully 2/3 of them are going to be destructive. So basically, if you think about it, it's kind of like doing a renovation on your bathroom. About 2/3 of the time is spent ripping everything out. Demolition. And then you spend time building things up. Well, we are now in the 30th chapter of Jeremiah. Jeremiah has been about his business of being a prophet for quite a while. He's gotten himself into a little bit of trouble with a variety of folks. It's hard business being a prophet. But what's happening around them is that the culture, the community, the nation is more and more and more at risk. There are more and more and more signs that things are not going to go well for them. Hundreds of years ago, that northern kingdom of Israel fell to outside forces. And now the rulers of Judah, of that area that still exists, that southern kingdom, well, they're trying to make whatever deal they possibly can to secure the safety of their nation. And little of that has to do with who God is. Little of that has to do with paying attention to what God has called them to be about as a people. And so things are getting desperate. And in that despair, there is a sense of imminent loss coming. And in that moment when it is becoming clear that things are not going to go well for us, Jeremiah has a word from God, from the Lord, for the people there. For people who are despairing. For people who are feeling crushed, or at least potentially it's coming soon. And that word is, I am going to do a new thing. It won't be like that covenant I made of old back in the wilderness. You remember that covenant when they were out there in the wilderness and they were just sure Moses brought them out of Egypt, but now we're going to die out here. And Moses went up on that mountaintop and he came down with the law. The law had been chiseled on stone tablets. It was an external thing that was handed to the people. Live this and it will go well for you. The law was this external commandment, a covenant from God that said, here are the things that you are to do. And when you do these things, you will experience loving kindness. You will experience well-being. When you do these kinds of things, you will experience community. But you see, that had not worked. They had not been living up to what that calls them to. You remember what those are. You shall have no other God. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. You shall remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. I'm waiting for y'all to join in. Okay, we won't do that. And so today, what God promises to that people who are looking at the imminent destruction of all that they have loved and cared for, He promises a new covenant, a covenant that is not an external thing written on stone, but that God will write God's law on their hearts. That God will give them an awareness of God's presence, that God will be in them, that wherever they go, wherever you go, God is there with you. That you won't have to say to one another, know the Lord, because you already know the Lord. Because God is with you no matter what. You will know right from wrong. Now, there are some traditions. In our tradition, we tend to consider grace. Grace. There's just one, right? It's God's grace. But there are other traditions within Christianity that understand that there are graces. And at times, it's helpful for us to think about that. One of the things to think about is that the law is a grace from God. That it helps to order our lives helps us to live in that sense of well-being and loving kindness, that in the midst of that, it shapes the way that we are in relationship with God and with one another. And as it does that, we find reconciliation, we find peace, we find forgiveness, we find new life. So today, what we hear Jeremiah argue, what we hear Jeremiah promise, the voice of the Lord is that we shall receive a new covenant. That where there has been an external law and covenant, that covenant is now written in our hearts. Through the waters of baptism, we receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. And as we walk, as we move, we are called to seek those ways to be aware of God's presence in our lives and in our very being. And beyond that, we are emboldened and empowered to bring that external expression of who we are into alignment with that internal reality of our identity as God's children. And so we are here to celebrate the ways that God is working for us and in us and through us to bring our lives into alignment so that that which is external and that which is internal has integrity. And we live in the grace of God, which brings us into a sense of love and well-being and forgiveness and reconciliation